patterns that you can do anywhere, anytime. There's a partnership here with two fantastic sewing bloggers, Emily from OYayStudio.com and Stacy from CraftyStacy.com, that are bringing you these fun and simple patterns and projects. You'll be able to see on your screen a pizza pouch and a coffee cozy that you can do. And these are just two of those free patterns that you will receive. And you'll get one pattern a day starting on April 6th, delivered directly to you. So you can get right back to your machine and make something beautiful. Oh, so simple sewing challenge coming at you very soon. So sign up for that. Again, click right underneath your video screen. As we get into your questions, I would like to just preface and say, I know I'm a new face for a lot of you, and I'm also pretty new to sewing. So I'm really excited to learn about maybe some projects that I could get into. So as I throw it over to Nikki, I guess starting off with, what's a great spot to start if I would like some simple, basic sewing projects that I could dig into right now, maybe this afternoon?
Yeah, get started as soon as you can. Well, hi, Leah. Hi, everyone. So I know, yes, a lot of us are home and having time to sew now. So some basic, simple projects to get you started. It kind of depends on what floats your boat. You can do just some little things from fabric that you have in your stash. So recently I've been sewing scrunchies, which are really fast and easy to sew. It's really just a tube of fabric and some elastic. Some small basic things. So if you're new to sewing, just getting started, things that have simple seams, rectangular pieces, straight seams, like pillowcases, little tote bags, like a grocery bag, things like scarves, like a circle scarf, infinity scarf. They're really easy to sew, straight seams, and you can use fabric that you've got in your stash. So I know there are a lot of free videos and free projects on the National Sewing Circle website, nationalsewingcircle.com, of course. There are also a lot of beginner projects all around the web, but I used to work for Sew News Magazine and Sew It All TV and Sew It All Magazine. So Sew It All Magazine was always targeted toward beginners. So sewitallmag.com and sewitalltv.com. I believe they may still have some instructions up and images for free projects. You can check those out. Or if you have something in mind that you want to do, you can just search for it. You can search in the search bar on nationalsewingcircle.com, or just search on the internet. And the great thing about the resurgence of home sewing and this wonderful sewing community that we're involved in is, there are people out there who want to help and who have probably done some of the things that you're trying to do and made mistakes, so they can teach you, and they put their experiences out there on blogs or on forums. So you have a lot of resources to check out and to help you out.
That sounds great. Well, anything to add before we start digging into some questions?
Let's get to it. I want to answer some questions.
All right. We do have one from Lisa to get us started. Hi, Lisa. Thank you for your question. My kids are home from school for a while. Any suggestions on fun/easy projects for them to make? Also, any tips on teaching kids to sew?
Yes. So my kiddo is home from school for a while too. So we're all kind of in the same boat here. So kind of like I was talking about as projects for beginners, like those pillowcases, scarves, those are great for kids to make. My daughter's been very interested in sewing lately, and I tried to make an apron with her the other day. And aprons are great for kids. They love them for crafting, but it was just a little bit too long for her attention span. So try to keep it really short and, little bits at a time. Don't expect them to take a project from start to finish, because they'll get bored and then they don't want to do it, and then blah, blah, and then it becomes a thing. So little short bursts, let them do the fun parts, picking out the fabric. My daughter likes pressing the foot pedal. That can be a little bit dangerous when I have my hands near the needle, but you have to demonstrate good good sewing technique for them. So keep your hands away from the sewing needle, especially when a 6-year-old is driving the foot pedal. But she likes, pressing a button and watching the machine work. So letting them do something so that they can see what works. I let her pick out the thread. It's fun for her to look at the colors. And they like projects that they can use right away. So those pillowcases, little tote bags, something that she can, put her doll stuff in, just like little pouches that they can use for their toys. So little things like that they get excited about, and especially, picking out the fabric is really fun for them. And like I said, let them do the fun parts and the safe parts. She's going to have to wait a few years before she can cut out any fabric. So I'm doing that step for her generally when she's not in the room. So I get everything prepped for the project and then call her in and let her, do parts of it. And I finish up the hard parts or the boring parts. And then she gets something that she can play with. So, small bursts. I keep mentioning pillowcases, but that's such a great kid project, and it's so easy. It's a rectangle, and then they can sleep on it that night. So that's something that can kind of whet their appetite for sewing and making, a little instant gratification. So that's fun with kids.
Great. Well, hopefully that's helpful. That's a great starting point. Let's move on to Angie's question next. Well, this is a good one as well. My local fabric store is closed right now, so I'm having to order online. How do I know if I'm buying good quality fabric? I usually go off of the feel of the fabric.
Yes, that is a really good question. Buying fabric online has always been hard for me, and now that buying fabric online is kind of the only option for a little while, how to do that well. You get your kind of trusted fabric online retailers. So mine are girlcharlie.com for knits. They sell knits. That's Girl Charlie, which is CHARLEE.com. And I love the Girl Charlie website because they tell you the weight of the fabric. And they measure the weight by taking a square yard. Sometimes it's a square meter, but a yard and a meter are very similar. So a square yard, and they weigh it. And if it's, if it's 7 ounces, it's a lighter weight fabric. If it's 10 ounces, it's a little bit heavier and maybe a little bit thicker. So that gives you another kind of quantifier to know kind of how it's going to work, how it's going to feel, how it's going to drape. And unfortunately, there's no replacement for getting your hands on a fabric off the bolt when you're about to buy it. But that weight measurement is really helpful, so I love them for that. Wyndham Fabrics is an awesome online retailer. It's WINDHAM fabrics.net. They have a lot of quilting cottons, a ton of fun prints. For other types of fabrics, Cotton and Steel has started doing some knits and some rayons in Cloud 9 Fabrics. It's cloud9fabrics.com. They have mostly quilting cottons, but they have a lot of flannels. They have some batiste that I was recently working with. Canvas. I believe they have some like duck cloth and oilcloth. So those are some of my favorites. Some fabric companies will also send you swatches. So if you have the time and the patience to order a swatch and feel it, but also, the swatches are kind of small, so it's still a little bit hard to feel how, if you're making a full skirt, it's kind of hard to feel how that's going to drape from a little swatch, but it's better than nothing. And a lot of fabric websites will have reviews on the fabric, or if that particular retailer doesn't have a review on the fabric, you can search for it on the internet, and maybe a different retailer will have reviews for it. So that's always helpful to see what other sewists have said about the fabric. So it's hard buying fabric online, but you can kind of search around, and it's a little bit of guesswork. But you can find some good trusted retailers, and you kind of have to take a leap of faith and hope it works out. But once you buy fabric, I do encourage you to leave a review so that someone else who's thinking about buying that fabric will have a little more information about it.
Great advice. I hope that's helpful, Angie. Let's move to Kate's question next. Kate asks, when sewing with knit fabric, can I use steam when pressing, or should I stick with a dry iron?
Yes, you can absolutely use steam when pressing knit fabric. The only scenario where you wouldn't want to use steam, I think, is if you're sewing something that's a synthetic fabric that might melt, and in which case you would want to use a very, very low dry iron. So if you're unsure of the fiber content, press a small square that's kind of hidden from the front of the project, or test a small swatch before you iron your project and see how it reacts to heat. But when in doubt, start low, and then you can kind of increase the heat from there and see how your fabric reacts to it. But yeah, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to use steam on knits.
All right. We'll move on to a machine-related question. Can you do embroidery on an ordinary sewing machine, or do you need an embroidery machine?
So embroidery, yes. Short answer is yes. You need an embroidery machine to do embroidery, because embroidery, the designs come as a file, and the machine reads the file, so it knows where to go with the needle to stitch out those threads in that design. Sewing machines don't have the capability to attach a hoop on and read those files and move the hoop and the needle around where it needs to. However, a lot of sewing machines have a lot of decorative stitches built in, which can kind of act like little strips of embroidery, although it's not, embroidery in the traditional sense of an embroidery design. So you'll be able to see on whatever machine you have. I have like 70 built-in stitches on this FOF Passport 2.0, and a whole bunch of them are just decorative, like little floral stitches, but it's all continually in a line. So it's going to be stitching out in a line. So short answer is yes, you need an embroidery machine to do embroidery, but you can kind of do decorative stitches and mini embroidery designs on a sewing machine.
Getting just a little bit creative. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to Carolina M's question. No matter what I do, the tension and the needles, when I sew with acetates and lining fabrics, they always pucker. Do you have any suggestions?
Yes, I do. So the puckering of the fabric is a lot of times an indicator of tension issue, as you know, Carolina, as I'm sure you have messed around with all kinds of settings. I have a couple of suggestions. Maybe you've already tried them, maybe not, so hopefully I can help. I'm sure you've tried needle tension settings, tightening up that needle tension so that the needle thread and the bobbin thread lay flat. Try loosening it. If it's too tight, it could create puckers. One thing that you can try is when you wind your thread on your bobbin, if you wind at a really high speed, that adds more tension to the bobbin thread, which can then relax in the seam and pucker your seam. So when you wind a bobbin, make sure you're winding at an even medium speed to avoid putting too much tension on that bobbin thread. So you can try that. Try using a really lightweight thread. So acetate and lining fabrics are typically very lightweight. So it's a good idea to use a very lightweight thread. Some threads will say lightweight on them. Rayon threads are actually a little bit finer, and they have a nice finish, so they can a lot of times go more smoothly into your seams. You can try those. A thinner gauge needle, so a thinner needle like a size 60/8 needle can help. Try using a microtex needle on acetate and lining fabrics. That just creates a smaller hole in the fabric, so it creates a nicer seam. I don't know if it will help with puckering, but having the right needle and thread on your machine can only help. Getting puckers in the seam. So Ashley's going to laugh at me if she's listening, but if you have tissue paper, put a layer of tissue paper under your fabric as you're stitching. That tissue paper a lot of times can help stabilize the fabric just enough to eliminate those puckers. I use tissue paper under my seams when I'm sewing knit fabrics, and that helps eliminate wavy seams. So try that under your lining fabrics, and then that tissue paper will just tear right away from the backside of the seam when you're done. So just tear it away. It helped when I was sewing on batiste fabric, that batiste I was talking about from Cloud9 Fabrics. It was very, very lightweight and very delicate, so I had tissue paper under the seams, and it just helped support the fabric and support the seam, support the threads in the seam, and it made all the difference. So give that a try, and hopefully one of those things will help.
All right, good luck. Ava's got our next question. Ava says, I cannot for the life of me get my armhole seams to not be puckered. I'm also using a new sewing machine that is so sensitive it does not seem to have a slow setting. Any suggestions for that?
Yes. Hello again, Eva. So for puckers in your armhole seams, let me think about that one first. So you can try some of the puckering solutions that I was talking about just a second ago, but for puckering in the armhole seam. So when I think about puckering in an armhole seam, I think about inserting a sleeve cap into an armhole. So you can tell me if I'm wrong there, but a lot of times you'll get puckers on that sleeve cap because there's just too much fabric trying to get eased in. So pattern companies, I don't know why, but they add way too much ease in their sleeve cap, and you do not need that much fabric. You just need a little bit of fabric to go over your shoulder bone and give you enough room for your shoulder to move. And they add 1 to 1.5 inches of ease in that sleeve cap. So you have so much fabric that you're trying to ease into that armhole seam that it's just too much to ease in, and you get puckers, you get gathers, you get tucks. So one thing that you can do for that is you can take some of the ease out of that sleeve cap. And I usually do that at the pattern stage. So there's a method for slashing and pivoting that sleeve cap in to take some of the fabric out of that sleeve cap to make it easier for yourself to ease that sleeve cap into the armhole. So you can give that a try. And as far as your sewing machine having a slow setting, check your machine manual. Most machines have speed settings so that you can bump the speed way down. Mine is just a little tab on the side here, so it's very intuitive. But a lot of newer machines have, the LED screens and all kinds of different functions where you might have to go in to a setting and, try to find that speed setting. But it should have information on it in your machine manual. And if you can't find it, you can go online and search for your machine manufacturer and model, and then add speed setting to your search term. So if I wanted to search for my FOF Passport 2.0, my search terms would be FOF Passport 2.0 speed setting. And like we were talking about earlier, the sewing community has so much knowledge to share. So you can pick your fellow sewists' brains as well for your specific machine.
Okay, our next question is coming in from a guest. Is there a successful way to sharpen rotary blades? Have an electric sharpener, disappointed with it.
Yes, that's a very good question. My rotary blades are so expensive. So if as much life as you can get out of your rotary blades, you definitely want to do it. So this method works for scissors and rotary blades. So everybody has aluminum foil in their house. Take some aluminum foil, fold it so that you've got 4 or 6 layers, and take your rotary blade and just cut through the tin foil a couple of times, making sure that blade goes all the way around. So cut 4 or 5 times, try it out. If it hasn't sharpened yet, try it a couple more times, but that'll sharpen up your blade pretty quickly. I did a tip video about that for National Sewing Circle not too long ago, and when I was trying it out for myself, I used it on my rotary blade, and I had a nick in my rotary blade, so I needed a new rotary blade anyway, but I wanted to try it. And if you have a really big nick in your blade, this tin foil method isn't going to take care of that. But if you have just like a tiny nick maybe, or if it's just a little bit dull, that tin foil method really sharpens it up actually surprisingly well and surprisingly quickly. So you can do the same thing with your scissors. Just fold that tin foil to get 4 or 6 layers, and with your scissors, just snip into the tin foil 4 or 5 times, starting right at the V and all the way to the tip, and give it a shot. It's cheaper than buying new rotary blades for sure, and I think you'll be able to get some more life out of your blades.
Great advice. I'm taking some of this advice for myself. This is great.
Great.
All right, our next question is about an iron. Looking to replace my iron. Do you have any suggestions? And what features should I look for in a good one?
So for an iron, I don't have suggestions for, I guess, specific irons. I'm using a Black & Decker iron on set here, and what I like about this one is that it's got some serious steam. So I like an iron that you can really crank up the steam, but you can also put it down low for fabrics, like delicate fabrics that you don't want to steam, like velvets you don't want to steam. And I think most irons have this nowadays, but the safety feature where if you have your iron down and it's sitting for a certain length of time, it'll turn off. Super important. I guess steam. Yeah, steam is like my number one thing. I like having an iron that heats up quickly and gives me, some good steam when I want it. Unfortunately, I don't have a recommendation for a specific brand, but maybe some of our other guests might have some suggestions we can share.
All right, feel free to drop anything, questions or comments in that chat box as we keep going. Our next question is coming in from Sylvia. Hi, Sylvia. Sylvia wants to make her daughter a pair of slippers. What do I use for the soles so they are not slippery, but they can be sewn on?
Let's see, for slippers, for the sole of slippers, something that you can sew on, but is not slippery, like a fleece sole would be super slippery. But something that you can do is add beads of glue to the bottom of a fabric, as they do on, non-slip socks. They have those little beads of stickiness to grab onto the floor, so you're not slipping everywhere. You can use hot glue and try to put some little dots on the bottom. If you have some other types of fabric or craft glue, you can put some dots on and see how that works. But if you want a fabric that is kind of sticky, I'm thinking like a faux leather. Something that has a texture to it would be even better to grab onto, like a hardwood floor, so nobody slips around. Oilcloth is also sticky. Probably use that for a sole. You'd want to have a lining in the slipper as well, of course. So faux leather, oilcloth are kind of some sticky fabrics. I think those are the suggestions off the top of my head. I've never made slippers before. I've thought about it, but I haven't actually done it. So that's just that's coming off the top of my head for sticky fabrics. So you can try some of those and see how it works.
Good luck. Marcella has our next question. What is a good needle for sewing elastic fabrics? I have a shirt I want to take in, and it's a stretchy material, and I'm having trouble getting my stitches to take. What's going on?
That is a really good question. And this is something that I find myself talking about all the time. People love sewing on knits. Knits are great they're just comfortable, they're great for sewing garments, and people love to, they love to take in their t-shirts. It's a great way to, revamp a t-shirt, give an old t-shirt new life by changing it up. So people love to sew on their t-shirts and love to sew on knits, as they should. It's super fun. So the first thing I want to talk about when I'm talking about sewing on knits is using the right needle. So they make needles that are designed specifically for knit fabric. So a jersey needle, a ballpoint needle, or a stretch needle. Those are all designed for knit fabrics. And the stretch needle is designed for fabrics that are super duper stretchy, like spandex, something that's got a lot of elastic in it. But it also works just fine for sewing regular knit fabrics. So whatever it's called that you can find at your sewing retailer, jersey, ballpoint, or stretch needle. And the construction of that needle is designed so that the tip isn't super duper pointed, so it's not cutting through the fibers of the knit and potentially creating runs or just weakening the knit structure of that fabric and decreasing the life of it. The ballpoint needle and those other types of needles, the tip is slightly rounded. It's not dull. It's still going to hurt you if you poke yourself with it, but it's just slightly rounded so that instead of piercing the fibers, it kind of nestles in between, nestles in the knit construction between the knit fibers of those interlocked fibers. So it prolongs the life of the needle, and it's just designed to work well with knits. So if you are getting skipped stitches when you're sewing on knits, try skip stitches on any fabric. My first guess is it's a dull needle. So change your needle, make sure you're using the right kind of needle. Slow down your sewing. If you're sewing too fast, I was doing this today, if you're sewing too fast, that needle thread doesn't have time to go through your fabric, especially if you're sewing on a couple of layers. The needle's trying to go through and it has to make that connection with that bobbin thread to make your stitch. And if that needle is missing that connection, you're going to get skip stitches. So a dull needle will contribute to that. Slow down your sewing a little bit, give that a try. If you're using a thread that is too thick, that can give you problems with skip stitches as well, because if that thread is too heavy, it'll also have a hard time going through your fabric and making that connection. So yeah, try those things and hopefully that'll take care of the issue.
All right, let's move on to Kay's question next. Kay asks, what special what special tools and techniques are needed for success with making velvet garments? So what and when?
So velvet, yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky fabric to sew on. And I actually did a class for National Sewing Circle on how to sew velvets and making a velvet skirt. So that's full of information about velvet, but I'll give you the condensed version. So my top tips for sewing on velvet are one of the main things that makes sewing on velvet difficult is when you're sewing with right sides together, you have pile on pile. So that velvet has, the pile on the right side that makes it kind of fuzzy and makes it really soft. But when you put two piles together, you're going to get a lot of shifting. So to keep your layers even, you have to take some precautions. So use a lot of pins, or you can simply use a basting thread, hand based, on either side of your seam line before you stitch that seam to really lock those layers in place and prevent any creeping or shifting. Using a walking foot can really help. So my FOF has this dual feed foot that it attaches on the back. They call it the IDT foot, the integrated dual feed foot, and it works as a walking foot. So it just kind of clips under my presser foot, and it walks that fabric. So the lower layer of fabric, you've got your feed dogs on the machine feeding the fabric, but the upper layer of fabric, you don't usually have anything. So that can contribute to some shifting and creeping, especially when you're working with velvet. So getting a walking foot to feed that upper layer of fabric as well really helps keep everything even. Walking foot is great for when you're stitching on knits too, because a lot of times knits will get creeping. If you can decrease your presser foot pressure, that's super helpful when sewing on velvets, because on velvet, you don't want to crush the pile. So if you press too hard on velvet, it's another reason you don't want to press velvet or steam velvet, is it'll crush the pile. And then that pile, you can try to fluff it up with a toothbrush and steam, but if you crush that pile, it changes the way it takes the light, and it changes the look of it, and you can just tell that you've got, one section that's crushed. So when you're sewing on velvet, if your presser foot pressure is smashing so hard down on the velvet, it's going to crush that along the seam line. So when you open up your seam, you're going to have a line of crushed velvet right along your seam line. So if you can decrease your presser foot pressure, super helpful. I love that my FOF Passport 2.0 has an option for that. Just right there, I can decrease the presser foot pressure because I talk about it all the time, and I do it all the time. So some machines don't have that option and don't allow you to do that. So check your machine manual for that. If you don't have a walking foot, you can use a roller foot or a Teflon foot to help those layers glide smoothly. If you're working with a really fine velvet, you might want to think about getting silk pins. And silk pins are just really sharp, really fine pins that aren't going to leave noticeable holes in your fabric. Yeah, so those are some top tips for sewing on velvet. Yeah, hopefully that will help get you started. And there's a lot more resources in my big long class about it, but those are some important tips to get started with.
Great starting point. All right, our guest comes in with the next question here. I have a pattern, and at one point it says, understitch facing as far as possible. I don't know what it means to understitch. I'm not a very experienced sewer, and I've never come across that before. Thank you.
Yes, so understitching is, it's not something that you have to do very often. So it's not something that you might come across very often, but understitching is when you put a line of stitching in the seam allowance just to add some weight. So if you're understitching the facing, you're going to be stitching the facing and the seam allowance so that it has some weight, a little more weight to pull it under, so that facing is not, poking up and out of the front of your garment. So understitching is stitching either just the seam allowance or the seam allowance and the facing, depending on, some instructions will, or some definitions of understitching will have you stitching just the seam allowances, or some will have you stitching also the facing. I don't think it matters too much since it is the facing and it is on the inside, but all it is, the point of it is to add weight, so that is, pulling more to the inside and not coming out the front.
Right, I hope that helps. We have another guest coming in with a question here. What is the formula for figuring yardage for 1/2 inch or any width of accordion pleats?
Oh, Elaine, you're stumping me here. Accordion pleats. I could make something up, but it would just be made up. I gotta say, I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry. I wish I could help.
Perhaps a little Googling.
Yeah, some Googling. So I guess, so figuring out 1/2 inch accordion pleats, I mean, apart from, adding up your 1/2 inch pleats to figure out your yardage, yeah, I don't have a really good answer. I'm sorry.
If anybody can help, go ahead and drop in. If you've got a formula already, drop it into the chat box. We'll move on to our next question then. No math in this one.
Good.
What is the difference between polycotton, poplin cotton, and cotton? Thank you.
Yes. So polycotton, they say polycotton when the fabric is just a blend of polyester and cotton. And it's just kind of a generic, general term for any type of blend. And then cotton is, your 100% cotton fabric that's, spun from cotton, the natural fiber. And poplin cotton, I've heard that name, poplin, but a definition, I don't really have a good definition, I don't think. When I think of poplin, I think of like a lightweight cotton, maybe a little stiff, but I don't know what the difference is between poplin cotton and a regular cotton. So that's something that I'm going to be Googling afterward because I would like to know too.
Perfect. All right, let's just move right along here. How can I troubleshoot loose stitches on a sewing machine?
Loose stitches. So that would be a tension issue, and I could talk about tension all day long, but let's boil it down to some troubleshooting for loose stitches. So loose stitches, stitches that are not laying flat against your fabric, that sounds to me like tension that is too loose. So your tension is at a lower number, and you need to turn it up to increase the tension. And that will allow the stitches to lie flatter against your fabric. So yeah, give that a try. Tighten up your tension. Sometimes if you mess with the needle tension all the way to one way or the other of the dial, all the way to 0 or all the way to 9, and you're still having tension issues, sometimes it can be an issue with the bobbin tension, but I've never before had to mess with the bobbin tension in my machine. But you can do it. A lot of times they don't give you instructions on how to do it in your machine manual because I don't think they really want you to do it. It's a very delicate adjustment, and they would rather you bring it in to your sewing machine repair shop. It can be done. It's just a very, very minor adjustment to the screws. But before you go messing around with that, try tightening up your needle tension. Make sure when you're threading the needle thread, you're getting it between the tension discs. And the tension discs, that's what your tension dial is controlling. So your tension, if you increase your tension to put more tension on your thread, your discs get closer together and put more tension on that thread. So for all tension issues, I recommend take all of your thread off the machine, re-thread, make sure you're hitting all of the tension points, make sure everything is threaded correctly. Threading my machine is like, I don't even have to think about it anymore. So I think, of course it's threaded correctly, but there are some times when, you just miss a point, and you just have to look at it and think about it and make sure you're getting everything right. So it can happen to you even after you've been sewing for 20, 30 years. So take a look at it. Make sure that needle thread is threaded through all of the tension points. make sure your bobbin is inserted correctly. And for loose stitches, try tightening up your needle tension first and foremost.
All right. Ooh, this next question is perhaps somebody that's making a jacket for me because I always like mine to be longer. I have a pattern for a jacket that goes just to the bottom of my hips. What alterations do I need to make it knee length?
Okay, so to adjust the length from hip to knee length of a jacket, honestly, I would just continue that side seam down for the length that you want it to be. If you want that that side seam to flare out a little bit around your knee, you may want to, draw your seam allowance a little bit outward gently. But if it's going from the hip, that's the widest point of your body anyway. So if you go straight down from there, you shouldn't have any problems. And I think that's what I would do. I would just continue that seam line down, add however much extra you want, however much extra length you want, and should be good to go.
All right. Good luck. Karen's got our next question. Am I supposed to oil my machines, and where do I put the oil? I have a Singer Merit and a Singer HD 110C.
That's a good question as well. And the answer is very specific to your machine. I've never oiled a machine before, to be perfectly honest. I would say check your machine manual to check for how often they recommend oiling your machine. A lot of the newer machines actually don't want you to oil them. And if in the machine manual it doesn't say to oil them, I would say it's best not to. But if it may specifically tell you in the manual to oil them. And if it wants you to oil it, it should tell you specifically where. And you can also, if you don't have a manual or if it doesn't say in the manual and you want to do a little more research, you can go online and check, search Singer Merit oil or Singer HD 110C where to oil, and see if you can come up with some answers. Somebody else who has that machine and maybe might know specifically for that machine. But really, I've never oiled a machine, and I've not read in any of my machine manuals that I'm supposed to. So unless you have problems with the timing or something, I'd say you're fine. But you can, do a little more research too to find specifically for your machine, because each machine, machines, they do basically the same function, but they can be super different.
All right, so a little specificity never hurts.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, speaking of specificity, our next question. Is there a specific needle and thread to use when sewing fabric that has several sequins?
So sewing sequin fabric, it depends on the weight of the base fabric that the sequins are attached to. So if that base fabric is super lightweight and kind of sheer, you want to use a thread that is lighter weight. You'll want to use a needle that is smaller size needle, and maybe even a microtex needle, although a universal needle will probably be fine. Size 60/8 is a nice small size needle. But if the base fabric of that sequin fabric is not super lightweight, I'd say you can probably just use an all-purpose thread. Sometimes sequin fabric has a knit base. So in that case, you would take all of your precautions for knit fabric using a stretch ballpoint or jersey needle. Make sure you're using all-purpose or 100% polyester thread, which is the best thread for using on knit fabrics. I don't know if I mentioned that before when we were talking about knits. 100% polyester or all-purpose thread, good for knits. But otherwise, for your sequin fabric, just a universal needle, all-purpose thread should be fine. just make sure when you're sewing, you take the sequins away, take them off the fabric along the seam line. So you don't want to stitch through those sequins. If they don't break your needle, they'll dull your needle really quickly, and you don't want to have a sequin stuck in a seam line. It's gonna, bend funny and mess with the drape of the seam and be weird. So if you can take those sequins off, a lot of sequins are attached by one long thread, so you might have to put some fray check somewhere or tie off a thread somewhere before you snip that sequin out of the seam line and out of the seam allowances. But yeah, otherwise, that's all you'd have to do for sequin fabric. It depends on the base fabric that the sequins are attached to for what needle and thread you want to use.
All right, we actually have a little bit of information to inject here about the poplin question from earlier.
Good, thank you guys.
Coming through, I don't know if I'm getting this name correct in the pronunciation, but And is right here in the comments. Poplin, also called tabinet, is a fine but thick wool, cotton, or silk fabric with a horizontal warp and a vertical weft made with twice the yarns.
Ah, okay, so it's double weft, so it's probably very tightly woven and nice. Okay, it's good information.
Thank you so much for popping that into the comments. Oh, we can move right on to Kathy's question next then. I want to make a baby blanket using 2 pieces of minky fabric. Any helpful hints before I get started?
Yes. Good for you, Kathy. Minky is super, super soft. It makes a great baby blanket. Sewing Minky together can be a little bit tricky because Minky is that really like furry, fleecy type fabric. It really is almost fur. It's got such a long nap, which makes it super comfy and cozy. But as we were talking before about creeping of the velvet nap, Minky also has that nap, so you might get some creeping. So to combat that creeping, you can use some of the tips that I talked about before for creeping, or just use a lot of pins to hold everything in place as you're sewing. Decrease the presser foot pressure, use a walking foot, and just go slow and just remember, chant Om to yourself if you have to, because you can get a lot of movement with that Minky and it can be frustrating, but you come out with a project at the end that's super nice and cuddly and cozy and super cute. So as long as you take some precautions against slippage, I think it's going to be fine. So just some of those creeping tips that I talked about, and good luck and have fun.
All right, we're going to get into our very last question here from Eva. Eva says, I have a pattern for a dress, but the bodice is too short. I have an inkling that I can just add a few inches to the bottom of the pattern, front and back, as long as it's the same length on both sides and shape. Is that a good idea?
Yes. So for the bodice of a dress, yes. And whatever you do to the front of the pattern, you want to do to the back of the pattern as well. And since that bodice then is going to be sewn into the skirt of the dress, you want to make sure that when you extend the side seams of the bodice, you extend them straight, because a lot of times the side seams of a bodice will be kind of slanted in. So you don't want to continue that slant and add length to your seam just going straight down, because then your slant is going to get way too narrow. It's going to get too small for you, and then that circumference seam is going to be too small for the skirt circumference that you're then attaching it to. So make sure then that the length that you're adding to the bodice seam is going straight down, and you're not changing the circumference of the lower edge of that bodice, so that the seam that it is getting attached to will still fit onto it. But yeah, you can. You should just be able to add a few inches to the bottom and customize that to your liking. And I love that about pattern making is it's really just simple shapes, and you can just draw in here and there and make it perfect for you.
All right. Well, at this point, we are to the end of our time for this month. So again, thank you, Nikki, for all of your answers to these wonderful questions today. My name is Leah. I've loved spending time with you here at the National Sewing Circle, and we will be back next month. So if your question did not get answered, please come back and see us next month for another Q&A, and we'll be answering more of your questions then. Until then, take care, and we will see you soon.